All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I don't think I need a microphone. But first of all, I want to thank you all for being here today. This is the kickoff of what I think is going to be a truly transformational process for the city of San Antonio, our 2022 bond. Before I go any further, though, we have some wonderful community servants who have agreed to be our co-chairs for the bond propositions. And I don't know if everybody knows each other, so I'd love if we can go around the room, just if you can introduce yourselves and which proposition that you'll be co-chairing. So we'll start with you, Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Fella. I'm the Executive Director of the South Alamo Regional Alliance for the Homeless, and I'll be co-chairing the Housing Board.
Yeah, go ahead. And I realize we are broadcasting,
Okay.
So this is an open meeting, and I think it would be great if we can make sure you're heard.
Well, good evening. I'm Suzanne Scott. I'm the State Director for the Nature Conservancy, and I'm co-chair of the Drainage and Flood Control Committee. Thank you for having me here today.
Sure. We'll go back to you, Katie, since
Sure.
I didn't realize the broadcasting part. So
Sure.
thank you, Suzanne.
I'm Katie Vella. I'm the Executive Director of the South Alamo Regional Alliance for the Homeless, and I'll be co-chairing the Housing Bond Committee.
Chris Garcia, I'm a mechanical engineer at UT Health in Facilities Management, and I'm co-chairing the Drainage and Flood Control Committee.
Good evening. By day, I am community and impact advocacy for REI. By night and other times, I'm a community activist in D1, and I'll be co-chairing Parks and Recreation with Mr. Bailey.
Thanks, Jeanette. Jim Bailey, Senior Principal with Alamo Architects and Board Chair of Activate SA. I'm also one of the co-authors of the Housing Policy Framework. Looking forward to working with Jeanette on the Parks and Recreation Bond Committee.
I am Dwayne Robinson. I have the privilege of co-chairing the facilities with Chris Martinez. I am a native San Antonio, and I'm San Antonian, and I am beyond humble. Thank you, Mayor, for the opportunity to serve.
Hello, Paola Fernandez. I'm a planner and community engagement coordinator at Able City, a planning and architecture firm here in San Antonio, and I'll be co-chairing the Street, Bridges, and Sidewalks with John.
Hey y'all, my name is John Bailey. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council, otherwise known as NRDC, based in San Antonio, co-chairing the Street, Sidewalks, Bridges and Sidewalks with Paola. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Shirley Gonzalez, former council member of District 5 and current chair of the Housing Commission. Thank you, Mayor.
Great. Thank you very much. And again, my thanks to all of you for being willing to step forward and help us to guide the process of our bond propositions this year. Tonight is really an orientation, a get to know you, and also you'll hear from our great staff about the recommendations that we'll be putting forward to the committee process that will start in earnest next week. First of all, again, I just want to say thank you, but also to help us take a step back and recognize what a critical point in time we're in with regard to San Antonio and the transformation that's taking place. We know the challenges that we faced over the last couple of years, but really those challenges have been faced for generations. And these bond programs that we schedule every 5 years are major capital improvement initiatives in which we do our basics, but we also commit to transformational change. And on that note, the process that you're engaging in right now is building upon the other elements and plans that are already in place. And Jim mentioned one of them. One of the unique features of this bond is going to be a housing proposition that comes on the tail of the voters' approval of the charter proposition last year that allows for us to create major initiatives through the bond programs. And the housing proposition is building upon the recommendations in the Housing Task Force policy document that was ratified by Council in 2018. We also have a climate action adaptation plan. We have SA Tomorrow, which is a multi-pronged city comprehensive planning effort. So all of those, all of that work that involves thousands of our citizens here in San Antonio is the bedrock of the process that you're engaging in right now. In addition to that, As you know, the city just passed its FY22 bond, which has major capital improvement projects, more of those basics that you're familiar with. But we're also engaging in an American Rescue Plan Act process that is going to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars in the city and the county towards major transformational change. And then, of course, we are also anticipating some work and action at the federal level on an infrastructure plan, both human infrastructure as well as basic infrastructure for our city and our communities. So a lot of work is taking place right now in terms of resource allocation to the city. So my request for all of you is to be patient, but also to think big. We're all residents of this city. We all see the challenges, but we also see the opportunities. And as we embark on the bond process, which will ultimately culminate in a vote of the public in May of 2022, a vote that's called by the council in February of next year, we want to make sure that we are giving our community an opportunity to soar. So again, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over now to our city staff. And if you need anything from me or my office, please don't hesitate to reach out, but I am very grateful for all of you and your volunteering to serve. All right, have a great night.
Anuncio para las personas que hablan español. Si hay alguien que desee escuchar esta reunión en el español, con gusto pueden pasar al fondo de la sala y les entregaremos los dispositivos para que escuchen la interpretación simultánea. Gracias.
All right, thank you for being here this evening and agreeing to help us with this very important public part of our process as we go through the next month and a half. For those of you that don't know, my name is Eric Walsh. I'm the city manager, and we've got a number of staff members here. Rod Sanchez, assistant city manager, will walk you through the presentation, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things for you as we go through here. This is our agenda for tonight. We'll go through the bond program overview, the committee process. Andy, our city attorney, will be here tonight to talk about our ethics and meeting guidelines. We'll talk about the staff recommendation, the status of staff recommendation of projects, and then talk about the committees themselves. Okay, let's go forward a slide, please. There we go. So just a little bit of history in terms of the municipal bond with the city of San Antonio. And you'll see that over the last, since 1994, really a departure from the first three periods of time there on the chart. In 2007, we started looking at obviously being a lot more deliberate in our municipal bond efforts. They're 5-year cycles, as the mayor mentioned earlier. We update those assumptions every 5 years. One of the major underlying assumptions is that there's no change to the tax rate. And you'll see that it has grown from the 2007, the 2012, and the 2017. At the point where we're at right now, back in August, we recommended to the council, given those assumptions and where we're at from an economic standpoint, that we were recommending a $1.2 billion bond program. You'll hear from Rod a little bit later on. When you calculate all the infrastructure needs that the city has, it's north of $6 billion. And so while $1.2 billion will be our largest bond ever to put before the voters and the public, it by no means satisfies all of our infrastructure needs. It is critical, though, as we go through this process, that we're identifying projects that we can complete or have under construction within 5 years. Because, and this is an update on our 2017 bond program, our commitment to the voters is that by the time they go to the ballot in May of 2027, that we'll have 97% of our projects completed or under construction. And that's part of our deliberate effort to make sure that we are timely in the delivery of the projects. We pride ourselves on this. Most major cities have trouble with this, but based on the infrastructure we have internally and the selection process we go through for design and construction, this is something that is critical to our commitment to the public. Just so you see, this is the 2017 bond program. We have We will have 97% of those projects done or completed by the time voters go in May of 2022. Here's our $6.6 billion in infrastructure needs, 2.4 in streets, 3.1 billion in drainage, over almost half a billion, over half a billion in parks, over $300 million in facilities. And you'll see as we go through this process, we've been a lot more deliberate in terms of our facilities in looking to see what we need to do at all of our facilities. And then almost $200 million in public safety facility improvement needs. So these numbers were changed today, and we'll make sure you have, I think you have an updated memo that I shared with the council today. Based on the B session that we had with the council last week and the staff recommendation on the allocations by proposition, and a series of one-on-ones that I had with council members last Thursday and Friday, we made a number of changes that we shared with the council today. $480 million in streets, sidewalks, and bridges, $274 million in parks and recreation, $162 million in drainage and flood control projects, $150 million in housing, and $134 million in facilities. And the major changes here were streets, drainage, those amounts went up. And the decreases were in our facilities and our parks and recreation programs. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I think maybe towards the end of the meeting, I'll walk you through the memo I sent to council. There was, the council had asked for us to relook at maybe making adjustments to the citywide category of projects with a focus on basic infrastructure, roads and streets and drainage. Overall, prior to that memo, our citywide total, and we'll talk about what a citywide project is, was 129 million. And in that memo, it's been reduced down to 98 million. Overall, basic infrastructure went from 600 million to 641 million. So I'm going to hand it over to Rod to kind of walk through the committee process. And then he'll hand it over to Andy to talk about the ethics and the meeting requirements. And then we'll be available. And I think maybe we should cover the memo that you all have and what next steps are at the council level that I see. Yeah, you got to point that way.
All right. Well, good evening. Thank you all for being here. And thank you for stepping up to the plate to serve. We have a very, very important job, a pretty heavy lift, as you just heard the manager say. You know, there's $6.6 billion worth of needs in our city. And while 1.2 billion is a lot, and we're going to do some great things with it, there's still a lot of other projects, good projects, that did not make it on our staff recommended list. So that's why you're here. As you can see with the chart, each committee is going to comprise of about 32 people. You can have 3 people from each council district, and then the 2 co-chairs appointed by the mayor. And then, of course, we're going to have our 3 TriChairs that are going to kind of oversee the entire process. And you see, here's our TriChairs, just to introduce them. You got Berto Guerra, Brandon Logan, and Jamie Kowalski. They weren't able to make it here tonight, but they have a very important role, and they're going to be working with all of us. We will probably see them at the different bond committee meetings as they go on throughout the next 3 months. And co-chairs, as you can see, you all introduce yourself, you know who you are, but we have assigned assistant city managers to help just keep the meetings going. As you can see, streets, I will be working with John and Paula. And on drainage, I will also be working with Chris and Suzanne on that one. For parks, we had David McCary. You can't miss David. He's 6'8", power forward. He can still slam dunk, so he tells me. And he's over parks and recs. It's very appropriate for him to staff that committee. Facilities, we have our deputy city manager, Maria Villa Gomez. And for housing, Lori Houston. All right. So, as I said, big lift we have in front of you, and you guys are the leadership of these committees that we're going to be having over the next couple of months. So your job, and staff will be there to help you, but your job is to keep the meeting moving. On the streets and parks, we have tons of projects. There's some 60 projects on streets that we're recommending. I think 64 park projects that we're recommending. So there's a ton of projects on those lists. Your job is to go through all of those projects, vet them, listen, understand, what these projects are about, why they're needed, what impact will they have on our community. And after you hear that, there's a lot of good projects, as I said, that didn't make it to the list. So you want to hear some of those as well. What are these projects? What can they do? How do they weigh against the others? And ideally, at the end of the process, I think what we would like is some kind of a ranking of those projects. Because after it's all said and done, you're going to make a recommendation to the city council. And city council is going to get your recommendation, and they may decide, we really want more money in streets, or we really want more money in drainage. So it'd be very helpful if we have those projects ranked, so that projects that are recommended for funding, if that line gets moved, we know which projects to add to fund, or vice versa. If we shrink a bucket, well, those projects on the bottom then may not get recommended for funding. So it's very helpful. It'd be very helpful if we can do that ranking through this process. So once again, it's very important that you guys help keep the discussion going. We want to hear from everybody. Staff will make a presentation, and after that, we want to open it up. You're going to hear from folks that, as an assistant city manager, I've been joking around. No one calls me. When I was director, everybody called me, and I became assistant manager. Nobody called me, but over the last month, my phone hasn't stopped ringing with people who want to get their projects on there. So I suspect the same is going to happen at these committees. You're going to have people show up that had this great project that we don't know about. And, we're going to listen to them. We're going to vet that project out. But bottom line is, we got to keep this going. And at the end of the day, we need to come up with a recommendation to city council. The other thing I want to mention as leaders of this, a lot of you guys know this, we got to make sure that we keep the discussion respectful. This is a very emotional topic. People get very excited and very heated, and I understand that, and it's good for people to be passionate, but we need to keep the discussion respectful and keep things moving along. So that kind of falls on your shoulders, and us as your assistants will help you with that. But let's try to do that so we can get to the end of the line. All right, and these are the proposed meetings that we have scheduled. As you can see, we start with streets and drainage next week on Wednesday and Thursday. And then in November, we will do the others. We'll do the parks and housing on the 3rd and the 4th. We have facilities, and we will meet every other week. So this is the schedule that we're proposing. Like I said, there's a lot to discuss, and there's not a whole lot of meetings to do there. So it's important that we, as I mentioned, keep the discussion going. It's hard to get used to this. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Segovia to walk you through the next part.
Good evening, everyone. Andy Segovia, as city attorney. 5 years ago, when I gave a similar presentation to the bond committee chairs, I was the new city attorney. To borrow a phrase from Consumer Products, now I'm the refurbished city attorney. So I'm not the new one, but I want to go over real quickly the ethics and meeting guidelines. We've tried to simplify them this go around. Frankly, last go around, we overlaid the complete ethics and campaign finance code on the bond committees. That turned out to be a bit more complicated than it needed to be, frankly. We found a lot of people saying that some participants should not participate in the discussion of a particular project. And there was a lot of, frankly, ambiguity in terms of who can participate and who couldn't. So we tried to simplify on this year, and that's what I'm going to go over. I don't know if I'm not pressing it hard enough. There we go. All right, it looks like no, I got it. Okay. Conflicts of interest. The city ethics code and campaign finance code do not apply per se to the bond committees because y'all are purely advisory. However, we're asking the committee members to use their individual judgment in deciding whether to participate in a specific discussion on a project or a matter. And we strongly recommend that members recuse themselves if they have a conflict of interest. So what is a conflict of interest? A conflict of interest would be a matter in which the committee member or one of your family members, be that a spouse, a child, or other close relative, is going to have a direct economic interest or benefit from the project or the matter you're talking about. But I want to emphasize the word direct. It doesn't mean, for example, if you're talking about a project that benefits, for example, UTSA or Texas A&M San Antonio, it's not a conflict of interest if you have a college age child who may eventually go to one of those universities or is going to one of those universities. That's not a direct benefit or economic benefit that anyone's gaining from that. That's just a general thing that any college age student in the community would benefit from. So a conflict of interest, again, I want to emphasize it's a direct benefit that you or a member of your family would get. Another example would be a project in which you're a member of a business or have an interest in a business that it's highly likely that that business may benefit from that project. That's another one where we would call it a conflict of interest. One key thing to remember is, again, because you're advisory, you don't have to worry about your participation in these bond committee meetings prohibiting you from entering into city contracts in the future. So I do want to emphasize that. Another thing I want to highlight is we're asking the committee members not to use your participation in the committee to unfairly advance either your business or yourself. A perfect example of that is if you're a committee member and you're there obviously promoting your company. For example, if you have a consulting company and you're passing around cards and you're using the committee time to advance that, that's obviously not something that committee members ought to be doing. The other thing is to be very careful with confidential information. Participation in the committee, you may be privy to or confidential information may be shared with you. We'll identify what that is, so you don't have to make the judgment, is this confidential or not? It'll be clearly marked. And again, if that sort of information is shared with you, we ask you not to disclose that. This is another easy one. If you're a committee member, we're asking you not to accept any gift that may influence your decision or may cause you to advocate for a particular project or position. I say this is an easy one because in your participation as a committee member or even as you're presiding over the committees, it's very unlikely you'll have a situation where you have people presenting gifts to try to advance something, which again is truly an advisory committee in nature. To give you an example, there may be some nonprofits that come in, for example, trying to advocate for a particular project or group of projects. If they leave a ball cap on the desk there, that's perfectly fine. Or if they leave a pen just identifying what their nonprofit is or what they do, that's perfectly fine. If somebody hands you a keys to a Cadillac, that's different. But I doubt that will happen. But that's the sort of thing we know. I use the two examples, extreme examples, just as use your best judgment on that. If it's suggest somebody's giving you something to try to get you to advocate for something, that's where I would, again, use your judgment, and it's best probably not to accept that. Meeting protocols. y'all are going to have a very challenging job. As Rod said, there'll be a number of people on the committee. It's a very topic that obviously engenders a lot of strong commitments, strong passions. So you're going to have to try to preside and make sure that your main role is to make sure, as Rod said, the meeting proceeds effectively and efficiently. You're going to use Robert's rules as a guide to manage the meeting. The reason I say use it as a guide, the other thing that we found last time was that sometimes committee members, frankly, were trying to use procedures to try to take over a conversation or to prohibit other committee members from participating. You as a co-chair or chair is best to identify that, and we'll have attorneys that are supporting all the committee meetings that'll help you with this. But again, procedures are there to help you manage the meeting. They're not there to be used as essentially to be weaponized to try to advocate a certain position or try to cut off discussion if discussion is needed or further information is needed for the community to appropriately evaluate the projects that are in front of them. A meeting is a quorum of any of the committee members. It could be at the actual meeting that's scheduled, or if there's an email going around with all the members of the committee, that's actually a meeting. So we discourage that. And so meetings should, again, the intent is to have the meetings in public and for them to be open. Again, as I said, a quorum is a simple majority of the members of the committee. When you have a meeting, before you start the meeting, you should ensure you do have a quorum present, and action should only be taken if you do have a quorum present. Open sessions, if there are votes, they should be voted in public. That's the intent, again, of the bond committees. The public may attend the meetings. The committee chairs will allow public comment, and the time allotted really is based on the chairs and, frankly, on the number of people that are signed up or anticipated to speak. For example, if you have 10 people coming up to speak, maybe 3 to 5 minutes. If you have 100 people, obviously you need to shorten that because, again, the ultimate objective is to make sure you are able to have the meeting conducted in an efficient, effective manner so that everything on your agenda can be handled in the time allotted. So you do have a lot of discretion in terms of being able to do that and allotting time for people to speak. So with that, I'll turn it over to Razi, who'll go over some of the recommendations. And I think we're reserving questions till the end. Is that right?
I'm going to cover this.
All right.
Andy, the clicker.
I was doing you a favor.
So one thing we haven't mentioned yet, and on the heels of, as Andy talked about the meeting protocols, Andy or one of the, or Liz Provencio, our first assistant city attorney, or one of our senior attorneys will be at each of the meetings, each of the committee meetings to help advise. And then also, as we go through the next couple of slides, one of my assistant city managers will all be assigned. So they are your primary contact. They'll help with the coordination. And of course, we'll have parks and public works staff or some of our facility staff who are going to help staff these committees. So you'll rely upon them. They'll be your primary contacts. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this. This matches the memo you have before you, but this is the breakout of the propositions. As council considers placing propositions on the ballot, under state law, we have to break out public safety facilities and municipal facilities. But for purposes of the committee, we're going to have one facilities committee that'll hear both those categories. So let me talk a little bit about how we categorized projects. And some of you that may have been engaged in the 2017 bond program may remember some of the issues that came up, and it really centered around what is a citywide project. Now, we were very deliberate as we went through this process, and our first conversation with the council in the spring of earlier this year on the bond program, We wanted to make sure that citywide was actually what it says, citywide. They are things like citywide bridge maintenance, bike lanes, and that was not the case last time in 2017. We've got a couple of different categories you'll see on this chart. We have district projects, which you'll see in the listings. That makes up the majority of the projects. Those projects were identified by a variety of different ways. They're either continuation of 2017 program, a bond project program. They are initiated by council districts that have heard from neighborhoods. They are initiated potentially by staff because they are needed improvements. And so that is the majority of the projects you'll be seeing. Housing is our new category at $150 million. And that proposition is going to look a little bit differently. In each of the propositions, we're going to have the actual projects listed. This will be probably a little bit more programmatic based. And our strategic housing implementation plan, which is nearing the end point of the briefing with the council, will be completed. And then that committee will that has Katie and former Councilwoman Gonzalez chairing will oversee that process. We have the linear greenway trails at $110 million. And this is a recent change. And I just shared with council this revised staff recommendation today. We are likely to have a special council meeting. We are going to have a special council meeting based on a request from council. But this $110 million, and you'll see in the package you have before you, has a breakout of how that $110 million in the segments. When last year, when the council placed the sales tax on the ballot for Ready to Work and VIA, there was a lot of talk about what we were going to do in order to continue to protect the aquifer with that program that's been in place over 15 years, but also continue in our build out of the linear creekway system. And we devised a way through the council last year to utilize SAWS revenue, an increment of SAWS revenue, to continue that Edwards Aquifer program. And the alternative we have before us to complete $200 million left in the Greenway was through the 2022 and the 2027 bond program. We also have some work that was done by a local nonprofit to add interconnects, but for purposes of what the city needs to do to complete the Greenway program, it's about $200 million. And so staff is recommending that we do half in 2022 and half in 2027 in that bond program. We have a category of regional, and regional for us means with our SA Tomorrow plan, we have 13 regional centers that were identified through that program. And when the SA Tomorrow plan was approved by council, we launched into a planning effort in each of those 13 areas. And we've gotten through about 5 or 6 of them. We've got a seventh that'll be completed later on this year. But they're areas of town that should be focus areas for housing development, employment, infrastructure improvement, transit-related improvements. And so our regional categories here are part of the plans that we have completed that the council has approved. They include Texas A&M, San Antonio, the Medical Center, Brooks, Port SA will be completed. Hopefully it's on schedule to come to the council in December. Downtown, and there's one more. I'm not remembering. There's one more, but that's regional. Our citywide category I mentioned earlier, and we'll kind of walk through that here in a little bit. And then public art, one of the policy issues that we heard from the staff, heard from the council at our first B session about 2.5 weeks ago. Our previous bond programs allocated 1% of the program towards public art, and there was a desire by the council to increase that. So the proposal you see on the slide here increases that to 1.5% in all of the propositions except for the affordable housing. So our guiding principles as we went through this process, were these top four areas, and I'll talk about the fifth area here in a second. But it was things like connectivity, public health and open space, resiliency, both in terms of natural and man-made hazards, equity, and then council input, because council members and Councilwoman Gonzalez could probably attest to this. As council members are in office, they are encountering situations in their districts where everybody starts to keep track of future infrastructure improvements that are needed. So council input is a huge driver of this process to begin with. And then obviously the council will review the final product that the committees provide back to them in January to place on the ballot. So the streets and sidewalks, Rod Sanchez, who was up here a little while ago, will be the primary point of contact for both the streets group and the drainage group, along with Razi Husseini, our public works director. But as of right now, in advance of any further council conversation, the streets and bridges and sidewalks categories at $480 million. 396 of that are district projects. 15 million are considered citywide, and they make up two projects. One is a $5 million citywide bridge maintenance item and $10 million in bike lanes. We have $7.2 million set aside for public art in this category, and a little over $61.5 million for projects within our regional area. This $480 million represents 60 projects today. Parks and Recreation, Mr. David McCary, Assistant City Manager who oversees our Parks Department, will be the primary point of contact with our Parks and Parks, Recreation, Open Spaces Committee. Currently today, in accordance with the memo I sent to council in advance of any further council conversation, it's $274 million or 68 projects. 107 of those projects are district projects, and you see the list. There's sometimes $500,000 or $750,000 in district in smaller park improvements. There are also two projects geared towards larger parks, new parks for the city. We have $25 million in the citywide category, $110 million, as I mentioned earlier, for the linear greenway trail system, $4.1 million in public art, and $28 million in our regional category. Flood control, $162 million. It represents 19 projects. The vast majority all of them are district projects. And we have $2.4 million in public art. One of the things we did differently this time, we went through our annual budget process this summer. We have a stormwater regional facilities operating fund that we have used in the past to cash fund capital projects, stormwater and drainage projects. And so some of the groundwork we did earlier in the year was lay out over the next 5 years how we can utilize the revenue from that fund to leverage dollars in the bond program. So we have a total of 8 projects, Razi? 8 projects that are half funded by our regional stormwater facilities fund and half proposed to be funded by the bond program. And frankly, that just allows us to stretch the bond dollars further. So in terms of investment for streets over the next 5 years, it's the $162 million plus the $38 million. In terms of facilities, we have 17 projects for $134 million. Almost $61 million are district projects, 58.6 in citywide projects, and 12.75 million in regional. We have $80 million in facility renovations and $50 million in new facilities to include a new police substation on the southeast side of town, a replacement fire station for Fire Station 10, and the facility committee will get a bus tour of some of these facilities and why we are recommending approval. There are categories within the renovation area where we looked to see what resiliency and deferred maintenance issues we needed to do to some of our major facilities, primarily as a result of February and the winter storm. So this is a category that the city probably hasn't done as well as we should have in the past in maintaining our facilities. This was an issue that came up last summer with the council, and we spent a considerable amount of time looking at our facilities. One of the major facilities you'll see that's proposed to be half funded by the bond program and half funded by the intercity TriChairs is the complete renovation and replacement of the Ella Austin Center on the east side, a building that is city owned and that we have spent a lot of money over the years to maintain, and is in the heart of a neighborhood. And so projects like that need to be renovated for the long term. That building's not going anywhere, and neither is the neighborhood. And we've got to make an investment in these areas. So our housing category of $150 million. There are a couple of different areas that will likely be the part of the conversation of the committee. A lot of this rests in the council conversation that they'll be having the first week in November in our strategic housing implementation plan, but could include permanent supportive housing development, rental housing production and preservation for households making less than 30% AMI. And you'll see we have a little chart over here to translate the AMI. Single-family housing preservation for households making less than 50% AMI, and single-family housing construction for households making between 60 and 100% AMI. These are the topics of discussion that the council will be having as part of the strategic housing implementation plan, and undoubtedly the housing committee. So I mentioned public art earlier. So it's proposed at 1.5%. For those of you that were trying to do the math, had we left it at 1%, that number would be about $9 million. So it's added additional resources to public art. And what we've done in the past is that we identify and utilize funds for significant art features. And one of the things we've asked council for feedback, and we'll continue to do that as we go through this process, is that still the desire of the council? We believe that we pool the money and make significant art enhancements with some of these projects, then it's more impactful and is a way of making sure that there's art distributed throughout the city as part of this program. So leverage funding, I've talked about a couple about these, but everything we can do to stretch the $1.2 billion, we've tried to do. We have 7 projects that were initially on the first bond list that we have proposed funding through 4 city-initiated TriChairs, and that relieved the bond list of about $77 million worth of projects. They include things like half funding of the Ella Austin Center, the North Broadway, northern section of Broadway through the Midtown TriChairs, some improvements at La Vida and Market Square, and we'll walk through that in the committees. We're also attempting to leverage MPO and federal funding with the Enrique Brera West at a city match of $8.1 million towards an MPO allocation of $13.5 million. We have the South Zarzamora Streets Overpass Phase 2 of $19 million, which is MPO funded. We've got a city match in the program that's proposed at $5 million. We do have an additional grant request outstanding that we should hear in the next 45 days. And if we receive that $5 million through another source, then that's money that we would not need to utilize on this project. And then I mentioned the $38 million from our Stormwater Regional Facilities Fund that we have programmed and financially planned for over the next 5 years. So next steps, I mentioned, and the council will have a special council meeting next week. Your meetings are scheduled to start next Wednesday, and we will certainly keep you apprised. You saw the schedule that Rod laid out. Our hopes is that the committees will complete their work in December, by mid-December. And we'll obviously work with the committees and each of you to make adjustments. We will go back to council, tentatively scheduled for January 12th, to share with them the bond committee list. The council will approve that list the following week in a session on January 20th, and then call the election on February 3rd of next year for the May 7th public vote. So that's our presentation, and I suspect you have a whole bunch of questions, and we've got staff here, and we'll attempt to answer your questions and get you ready. Yes, sir.
It's a very basic question, but just in terms of the putting together the agendas, note-taking, all that kind of stuff, is that stuff, are we responsible for that as co-chairs, or does staff do that?
No, we'll take care of that. Your assigned assistant city manager and the staff from the departments will take care of all the logistics, the note-taking, the follow-ups that will be sent out to all the committee members. And if there's any follow-up that comes up at the meetings, we'll do that follow-up and get it to the committee. Your job is to run the meetings, and our job is to make sure you're supported and not having to deal with the details. Suzanne first, or yeah.
So just, I heard this at the city council meeting, but I just want to make sure I understand. If we're talking about projects, and obviously we have people coming in and they may be submitting ideas or projects that are not necessarily on the list, we're capped at the number that we are assigned. So if one project, if we want to add a project, we have to delete a project. Is that the way that works? Or can we, keep a running total and do what Rod said earlier, sort of prioritize those, and wherever the line is, the line is?
Yeah, there needs to be some discipline in the process, but as Rod mentioned, and that's frankly probably it is the reason why the council wants to have a meeting next week. If we don't have limits, then what the council is going to get back in January is a $6 billion project list, right? So there has to be general categories. As it stands today, I shared with you the amounts in the revised staff recommendation. The council will have a discussion next week, and we'll keep you apprised. I do think that it would be important for the committees as we go through that process. Let's use streets, for example. As it sits in the current staff recommendations, $480 million. I do think it's probably wise for the committees, and we will work with you on this, to, as Rod mentioned earlier, have a prioritized list so that if the council in January decides that they want the 480 to be 500 million, then they know what projects the committee has looked at, and we're not creating projects in the middle of January. So I do think there should be an overflow and a list that's given back to the council. The converse is also true. If the council decides in January that they want streets to be 460 million, I think the committee should provide some recommendations on what that swing room is. And I think in the best case scenario, ultimately the council will have the final say with the project list. So the more information that the committees can give them in terms of priority, the better it is. I wouldn't call it a bright line. I'd call it a very dark dashed line with some boundaries and plus or minus 10, 15, $20 million. There are some agencies. I received letters this week from agencies that are asking for bond support. And we've had a number of conversations with the council. At this point, I think it's appropriate for them to come talk to the committees, because there will always be a letter that comes, and that list will never, ever die. It'll keep growing. And it is appropriate, I think, for us to talk about that at the committee. At some of your committees, it won't happen so much in the streets and drainage, but in some of the committees, some of the outside agencies that have asked for city funding the bond program. Part of this effort that we'll do with you at the committee level is making sure we're clear from the agency standpoint, what is the public benefit? There has to be a public benefit. And the council's talked a little bit about this at their open sessions. In parallel, what we'll be doing with those agencies is establishing the milestone or the public benefits so they can be documented. If the council decides to include them on the list, we will want interlocal agreements or MOUs with those agencies that solidify what the public benefit is. And certainly we're going to need to be able to communicate that to the public. It's not just, we can't give municipal bond money for private interest without public benefit. Yeah, Jim.
Thanks, Eric. This one actually may be for Andy regarding the open meetings request. Kind of specifically, what is the committee structure? Do we have 5 distinct committees that those rules apply to, or is there some larger committee structure that includes all of us and the TriChairs?
So that's a good question. It applies specifically to each bond committee. So it doesn't apply to the overall. Each bond committee is looked at as a separate committee. So you just have to be worried about quorums and open meetings for your particular committee.
Yes, sir.
So a couple questions, I guess. One would apply to the general committee, and then one specifically to facilities, which you may have just answered. So facilities, I'll start with the facilities because it says public facilities. So generally speaking, the facilities that will come under our committee will be city-owned facilities.
There are, and this may be actually in the parks category, but for example, there's a request from UTSA for a contribution towards the construction of a new basketball and volleyball athletic facility that would be constructed next door to their new football building, which the city contributed, I think, $10 million in 2017. And the council, I mean, the city doesn't own that building. The council approved a public use benefit for that football building. And so in those cases, for UTSA, for example, those agreements would have to be made and there would have to be a public benefit. The majority of the rest of the facilities are all city facilities. There are things like the Central Library, the complete renovation of the Carver Library, some roof replacement, generators at some of our public safety facilities. I mentioned the substation and one fire station replacement, but the vast majority of them are city facilities.
Second question. So a lot of folks in the general community, they don't understand that when you pass a bond and you're going to do, say, street improvements, they expect to see those streets improvements within the next few months or whatever.
Yeah.
Not really understanding that in the case of this bond, it's simple because we're talking about a 5-year period. So obviously we have a 5-year window to complete these projects. So with respect to the last bond, are there some projects that did not get complete for whatever reason? Let's say it's a public facility and it burned down and you're not going to rebuild it. Are there some carryover dollars from previous bonds in whatever category it may be?
There aren't any funds from the 2017 bond program that aren't allocated or assigned. We did have in the 2017 bond program an outside agency that proposed in 2017 to match city dollars for 2 projects associated with 2 of our parks. And when the pandemic happened, their fundraising efforts ground to a halt. And so earlier in the year, this year, through council, we allocated that money for other projects within that proposition, which the council can legally do. So generally, if there's going to be, now, that I said that 97% will be under construction or completed. There's a handful of projects that are still going through the process, but I wouldn't consider that money available for anything else. And to your other point, as we go through the fall and the project list continues to develop, one of the things that we're going to be doing is we will issue this debt on an annual basis. We don't issue all $1.2 billion at once. What we do is we lay out the project timeline, and frankly, years 1 and 2 are heavy design years for us. And so we will schedule out, in accordance with our construction schedule, the issuance of debt so that we're not sitting on money. So simple projects, shovel-ready projects, the design of projects will happen in the first 2 years. And Daryl, that's a great point, because that schedule will be something we'll come back to council in January when they see the final proposed list, so that they can see the scheduling out of projects. It's important in terms of the communication from a city standpoint, but I suspect from a campaign standpoint to be able to show that we have a delivery schedule of these projects. And some of these projects are very large and are going to take a little bit of time.
One more question. So out of curiosity, with my background being the county, so when I saw the list of the different categories, a specific role of county government is drainage. So obviously the need outweighs what the county can simply do or whatever. But when staff looks at these projects in conjunction with council, because you mentioned Broadway, and I remember myself, Judge Wolf, and meeting with some folks in Alamo Heights, because that Broadway area has a major, I'm sure Suzanne can attest to, has a major issue with respect to drainage. So because you mentioned Broadway, when we're looking at these projects to maximize what we can do, or we communicating with Alamo Heights to say, this is what we're proposing to do within the city, and if you can do something in partnership with what we are doing, then we can partner and really address that project, that issue, because I'm definitely aware of the fact that no one entity can do it all. The city can't do it all. The county can't do it all. And what we call those 26 suburban cities, they can't do it all. But I'm just curious as to, in particular, that issue, how are we working with the Alamo Heights, if that's the part of Broadway that we're talking about?
Yeah, it doesn't go that far north, but there is a drainage issue along North New Braunfels and Austin Highway that abuts San Antonio and Alamo Heights and impacts Terrell Hills. And our public works staff have had some conversation with Alamo Heights. But I'll tell you that we don't do a very good job of coordinating that. We have two council members here, Councilwoman Castillo and Sandoval, here with us tonight. And I'm coordinating a meeting with both of them, myself, and the county to talk about flood control and drainage, because there needs to be a better coordinated effort. And that Austin Highway, North New Braunfels is a perfect example. There are a number of examples in Councilwoman Sandoval's area in District 7 along the Woodlawn Lake area. That has been, we have some very large projects in that area that have gone through multiple phases and will take us some time. And so how are we working with other local governments to maximize that? You're right, the county does collect a flood tax, and making sure that that is being used to maximize and deal with flood control and drainage. The council today approved our hazard mitigation plan, which is required to be approved by us every 5 years to be eligible for FEMA reimbursements in time of emergency. Our hazard mitigation plan, I mean, we have, flooding is a major hazard in San Antonio. And our public works department identified $660 million in hazard mitigation flood control projects. We're going to need to come up with a plan to deal with that. And it's going to require a concerted effort between more than just the city.
Dwayne, to answer your question, Alamo Heights is funding that project in their city limits. They got a bond passed by their voters that is supplementing money that they got through TxDOT and other sources. County also put money in as well. So that project's moving forward.
But not the North New Braunfels and Austin Highway. We need to figure that one out
Right.
too. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So the mayor mentioned in his opening remarks the potential for infrastructure dollars from the federal government. And so in the event that some of these projects are eligible for those dollars as well, what happens if they've already been approved by the voters, or if it happens during that time when we are vetting the projects or in the attempting to get those approved?
That's going to be a great problem to deal with if that happens.
Absolutely,
right?
it will be a great
So,
problem.
I mean,
but,
I know Councilwoman Castillo has talked to Public Works about the $5 million MPO match, and hopefully we hear within the next 45 days. I don't know. The council also talked about this today. You guys watch the news as much as we do. I'm not sure what the timing of a federal infrastructure bill is going to be. We may have the ability, depending, it could be an adjustment that we make if it happens, say, next March, and we have a project that's on a potential ballot that's already been called. But part of what we're going to try to do is make sure that if there is federal money available, that we're giving them, we're proposing projects that aren't in the bond program or may be funded with current resources elsewhere in the city that we could reallocate if we got federal funding. The other part of this is that we do have an outstanding $25 million raise grant for the development of a large section of West Side Greenway trails. And so we're hoping to hear from that in the next 45 days by December. And so all these things are happening at the same time. We're going to need to stay nimble. We'll keep the committees updated. Obviously, the council will be keenly watching that as well. But things could change, and that'll be a good problem for us to have. Yes, sir.
For the rankings you mentioned, where it's kind of a good idea for us to have a rankings of all the projects, will you all provide us information on how to actually do that, or what the criteria is?
Yes, and we'll give you the scores that the city staff provided. I will share with you that for those of you that may be familiar with RFP processes and those types of things, this is not that, right? Because we have, we ranked, we scored, and I would consider that one guardrail on one side of the street. The other guardrail was really the council office input. And so, there will probably be likely a lot of conversation at the committee level about if you're going to provide a ranked list to the council, how many of those council guiding principles does it meet, and help us and help the staff, or we would help you kind of lay out the justification for the ranking. And I think some of that could be done naturally through the committee process, as long as it's got some sort of tie back to the guiding principles. Yes, ma'am.
Of course, it's caught on my earrings. You mentioned that the housing bond is unique in that it's not a set list of projects. So is the end result about who will be served and kind of the priorities for that 150 million when it comes to housing?
Yeah, and I think you're going to hear a lot of conversation at the committee meeting about how that's leveraging other resources, either resources that the city currently has. But the strategic housing implementation plan is really designed to target what can we produce and what's the outcome over the next 5 years. And so it's going to be more driven on an outcome in terms of number of units in those categories we talked about.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Why are public art funds not included in the housing?
because it looks differently and because we wanted the strategic housing implementation to be finalized by the council. It's not going to be, we don't think it's going to be project-based like this housing development on this street. It's more programmatic based. And so as we thought about that, it made more sense to focus on the entire amount on the housing and not apply that standard public art 1.5% to it. And it was just, it's going to be different. It's the first time we've done an affordable housing bond proposition. And so we didn't want to treat it like every other proposition the first time around.
But is a 1.5% also included? Is there additional 13 million at 1.5% that would go to other public art, or is it just not included at all?
It's not applied against the 150 million. It's applied to the other 1.05 billion only.
Okay.
Jim, do you have a question or?
Yeah, just real briefly, kind of following up on John's question about the guardrails that you described, providing us the criteria to evaluate these projects as a committee. Are you also, given that we have a limited amount of time, 4 meetings, will city staff be providing us with a set of kind of meeting by meeting objectives in order to kind of get across the finish line all at the same time? Or are we supposed to work with staff and sort of develop the run of show?
No, I think we're going to need to stay on task because there will be things that happen that we don't plan. And so the assistant city managers assigned to your group will work with you on that agenda, make sure that we know what objectives we want to meet for every meeting, and then leave ourselves some time, a lot of time for the committee conversation. And then we may have the public that wants to speak, or we may have outside groups that want to come in and speak. So making sure we allot that will be key, and we'll help you do that. So you and your co-chair aren't having to figure that out. We'll provide that resource to you. We'll be looking for you for guidance in terms of your thoughts about the management of the meeting and the control of the meeting. Will obviously be within your purview, but we want to make sure you're armed and ready. And when something happens in the middle of the meeting, I'll be at a handful of meetings. We'll react and adjust and move on. I'd love to have them planned out. It's just not going to happen that way, but we'll be ready. Yes, sir.
During the presentation, you mentioned each category had, for example, for drainage, 19 projects. So do those projects equal, let's say, the 162, or do they go a little bit more? Because you also mentioned we have a little bit of, we're going to rank the projects and maybe go plus or minus 20 to 15 to 20%. So does that 19 equal to that buffer that you're recommending?
No, it doesn't.
Okay,
That 19, that project list equals the dollar amount on that slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think I think each committee is going to be a little bit different. You look at the drainage list. There are no inexpensive drainage projects. So that may be one project you add or 2 projects you add if the council chooses to look at other projects. The facility list is going to look a little bit different. Drainage is very expensive, and as Suzanne can attest to. All right. So next steps, we're going to deliver to you a binder of information. We're also going to share with you John, the list of committee members that you have. Yeah, we'll email it tonight. We'll coordinate with you the notifications and everything else. Again, we want to make your job as easy as possible. John Paterick, who's standing up right there, is in my office, and we'll be working with Jessica. Stand up, Jessica. Jessica from Public Works. Those are the 2 primary traffic cops that are dealing with the bond program. And then we'll make sure you're prepared. Streets and drainage, again, next Wednesday and Thursday. And then we will keep you updated on the possible, or the council special meeting that will occur next week on the proposition amounts. So We appreciate your time tonight. Please, yes.
So quick question. So logistically speaking, I thought I saw somewhere where essentially all of the meetings will be in this room, correct?
Are they in this room, John, or in this? They're in this building. Yeah, because we've got, with 32 members on the committee and leaving room for public, we wanted to make sure people were spread out appropriately.
Some will be in this room. We're going to open that up and make a bigger table, for instance.
All right. Not assuming anything, but one of my hobbies is I'm an official. I referee football, basketball, those two sports. And those parents are a little off the hinges sometimes. So out of curiosity, will there be security at all of our meetings?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The security here tonight, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully we don't need that, but yes, sir. Okay, so we'll get information to you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. And this is a major effort that's going to lay out the city's infrastructure spend for the next 5 years, which is critical. We're all residents, and we all know that there's a great deal of need, and it's an exciting project and program. And what we're gonna do is really gonna set the framework for our major infrastructure improvements for the next 5 years in the city. So thank you very much for being willing to help us in this process. Thank you.